I don't feel like I've really absorbed this election result. I've been too down in the weeds of minutiae to look at the big picture, really. But obviously, one or two things have occurred to me in the month that has transpired since the election. I feel in particular that I should have done a better job of this slide. If I had my time again, I'd go through the Australian and pick out all the nonsense they talked about, things that definitely aren't going to happen this time because they've never happened before. And a lot of iron laws of history plucked out of the extremely limited amount of data that is available in terms of Australia's electoral history, in particular the the things that supposedly need to be in place for a change of government to occur. There are a lot of people who think that they've divined what needs to occur for this to happen. I could talk about Rod Sawford's formula. I didn't really, I had a look at that, but anyway, let's not get bogged down in that one. But one thing I did read a great deal was that the Albanese government's in trouble because it's a first-term government. It has next to no majority in terms of it had 77 seats out of 150. And given that there are always first-term swings against first-term governments in Australia, it would be defying history to maintain a parliamentary majority. Now, this is obviously nonsense to me. There have been so few changes of government in the course of the Australian electoral history in terms of the existence of the party system as we know it today. So you really can't draw any inferences and things that you think you can draw are, coincidences. Yes, if you go back to, I think, probably 1949, there was a swing against every first-term government, but most of them had come to power in the context of big landslides, which didn't apply at this occasion. Think results that would be intrinsically difficult to repeat again. That wasn't the case this time. And if you look back, there's always some contingent circumstance going on in any specific election, such that I felt that that particular myth was always just coincidence. One that I think had a little bit more meat on its bones is the notion that federal election results are more balanced than state ones, by which I mean that big election landslides tend to be bigger at state level than federal level. I think that's still true. It did, however, incur a certain bias towards conservatism in imagining what might happen at this election and imagining what might happen at federal elections generally. Because you've got, at a federal election, you've got 6 different states. It'll generally be the case that there'll be one state where the local dynamics in play are different from another state, and as a result, a big landslide will get tempered by 1 or 2 states that go against the flow. So it is true that federal election results are more balanced than state ones, but it's less true than was commonly believed. You can get a blowout election result at a federal level if all of the stars align in a particular way. Actually, one I should have thrown in here is that only coalition governments have federal landslides. Until this election, if you want a really big Labor win, the biggest ones were 1943 and 1983. This one was healthily bigger than the second of those, especially. Only John Curtin's wartime win in 1943 compares with this result. And as a result, it was tempting to say, I remember Stephen Smith saying this in 2007 when it became apparent on election night that the Rudd government had been elected. Yes, we haven't won a landslide, but that's not what happens in Australia. Labor do not win federal landslides. And I, have the greatest respect for Stephen Smith's acumen. I'm not. But he was, however, falling prey to the sort of lack of imagination you can have in observing the extremely limited amount of electoral history that exists in Australia and extrapolating from what are too small a sample of observations to draw general conclusions out. It turns out that Labor absolutely can win landslides on the order of 1975, 1996 to 2013, all of which had been on the wrong end of. Western Australia is a conservative state. That's one obviously close to our heart here. That's a misdiagnosis of what Western Australia is. It's not a ideologically conservative or progressive state. it has a particular history within the Australian Federation that causes it to behave in particular ways. It causes it to be resistant to assertions of power by Canberra. More often than not, that's played against Labor, but for 2 elections in a row now, the coalition have paid a very heavy price in Western Australia for getting on the wrong side of a Western Australian government, state government that had popular support behind it. The coalition campaign's better than Labor. This is the new one. I've never encountered this one before, but this is one occasion where I have teased out something from the Australian. This is something they ran in the first week of the campaign to convince themselves as much as anything else, I think. Where they recorded that Labor went backwards in news poll at every federal election going back to 2007. No, they didn't go backwards in news poll. They went backwards from the first news poll of the campaign compared with the actual election result.
Sorry.
It's bound to happen at least once. In fact, done. All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Where was I? All right. Okay. The coalition have come up with a new iron law history, which is that when you compare the first news poll result of the campaign to the election, then Labor goes backwards. The Australian didn't stop to think that news poll might have been inaccurate here. They should have been comparing the first news poll of the campaign with the last news poll of the campaign, in which case their tables wouldn't have looked quite as impressive. Nonetheless, but again, in each of these cases, I think there was continued circumstance. There was sort of something you could point to that, you know, yes, they just rolled Kevin Rudd. Yes, they just rolled Julia Gillard. Yes, they had an unsustainably big lead going in like they did in 2007. So I wasn't terribly convinced by this at the time, but they will not be repeating this exercise in 2020 whenever. Okay, I am about to move on to a slide. So, no, I'm still don't know up from down in this way as in so many others. What's going on here? Slide is not just me. Can you just cap it?
Sorry.
And I hope that the keeper of the Zoom and Google Wacky has moved on to our next slide. Am I where I want to be? Yeah, okay, so I think the big question about this election is how much of this is a endorsement of the Labor government and how much of it is the sort of black swan event of Donald Trump coming around and behaving like a bull in a china shop. I don't know. All I can do is point to the trends of the polling, and they don't offer any insight because so many different things are happening at the same time. In order to get to the bottom of this, we require survey polling research, which perhaps other people on the panel can better place to discuss this than I am. But clearly something extraordinary happens in the opinion polling starting from the beginning of February. And the best we can do is plot out the timeline and try to see where what lines up temporarily with when what happened. And again, because what's happening in the polling is so crude, it just simply something breaks in the beginning of February and keeps on happening. It isn't a one-off event. It's the emergence of a new dynamic that carries Labor forward to election day. And the polls were underestimating Labor. So either Labor were never behind in the first place, that I do rather suspect, or we've got a sort of underestimated dynamic. This is the polling aggregate I conduct on my own website. I think it ended up with Labor on 53.5%. I was sort of apologetic about that towards the end of the campaign, saying, oh, obviously that won't happen. But in the event, I was dramatically falling short. To my credit, I did not try to tweak the preference formula on my polling, which every pollster is doing. Every pollster formed the view, unscientifically, that Labor were not going to get a strong preference place in this election than they did last time. That was wrong. They did, and mostly because I was too lazy to change it. My method of basing preference flows on what happened in 2022 was pretty near the mark, and to the extent that my polling aggregate was wrong, it was because the polls were underestimating the weakness, especially of the coalition's primary vote, and to a lesser extent, the strength of Labor's primary vote. So the coalition were ahead in my aggregate from the beginning of November, I think, until the middle of February. But by the skin of their teeth, it was that there was sort of 50.2 to 49.8, but at that point it looked pretty terrifying for Labor, because this seems to be a trend that had been going on pretty much since the voice referendum. Labor had quite a steep narrowing in the period of the voice referendum in late 2023. After that, a slower momentum, but still what's looked at the time like an unstoppable momentum away from Labor. And then all of a sudden things quite radically change in about February of this year. So what happened and when? It was on the 25th of January that Jacinta Price was given a government efficiency portfolio, specifically, clearly, because the coalition had it in their head that history was on their side as a result of the US election result. I wouldn't pick on that entirely. There were various other politic things being said by Conservative politicians like Michaelia Cash, who clearly did think that the US election result boded well for them and that they could kind of ride that train to glory here. But that particularly, well, that one stood out for me, but I think a couple of other proxies could be in there for the coalition reaching the conclusion that the election of Trump was good news for them. When it became really apparent that that wasn't the case was when the first of the two tariff announcements was made. That was on 1st of February, and that coincides pretty well with the movement in favour of the Labor in the opinion polls. So I don't think, we have got two things going on here. We've got the coalition making a clear strategic error in imagining that Donald Trump represented some sort of great vibe shift people were talking about at the time, including myself. I'm not letting myself off the hook here. I didn't have a crystal ball in relation to any of this. I'm not letting them off the hook by saying, oh, they were doing great, but then Trump came along and ruined it for them. They created the circumstances in which that was able to happen. But the two events that really made the popular view say that, Trump is, something we need to radically react against his voters. Those two events were the tariff announcements of the 1st of February and the Liberation Day tariff announcement of the 2nd of April. I think the other really, in hindsight, catastrophic mistake that the coalition made was their announcement that they were going to innovate for home relations for public servants. That was on the 3rd of March. By that time, the momentum is already in train. But as I said, the momentum was not a single shift in the mood. It was a process. It was a dynamic that kept rolling. And I think the only conclusion to make from that is that the coalition kept making mistakes. The other point that I would make in relation to the polling trend is the lower of the two poll trend charts I have here. The upper of the two is the Labor two-party preferred vote. The lower of the two shows the net approval ratings for the two leaders, by which I mean approval minus disapproval. Albanese turns a corner in early 2025. I think you can sort of talk about that in terms of, a change in the mood, that he now looks like a slow and steady, safe pair of hands, which is what people want now that they're observing the spectacle of Trump in the United States. Even more pronounced, though, is the extent to which Peter Dutton falls off a cliff here. And that, I think, shows that there is simply something more going on here than the Donald Trump effect. If it had purely been the Donald Trump effect, I don't think his ratings would have collapsed quite as much. I think he was making fundamental errors. And I think that when the campaign dynamic kicked in, a lot of chickens were coming home for roost for him in terms of the way that he had played his politics over the previous 3 years. Now, people were starting to, weigh up policy options and what the two parties had to offer. He had a bare cupboard and wasn't able to campaign simply on the basis of sort of negativity and mood music about Albanese being weak. Okay, along to the next slide. I think I'd better leave that. That's good. I won't forget to announce that that's what's happening. So patterns in the swing. As I've said, I wished I'd spent more time probing into the minutiae of this sort of thing, but these are the things that have come through for me in terms of a little bit of analysis I've done in terms of statistical analysis of how the swings, booth level swings were distributed and how that aligns with various demographic variables. First of all, though, the obvious stuff, how things varied from state to state. There was a lot said, an enormous amount of said about how much trouble Labor was in Victoria. And, you know, we can laugh about that now because Labor would picked up seats in Victoria. Having said that, though, it was the case that a lot of these narratives ended up being not 100% wrong, but they ended up only being right in their relative terms. Quite a bit that was being said about the distribution of the result was borne out, but you know, the overall underlying floor from which Labor was operating was just so much higher than everybody thought. So over the course of the last two elections, what I refer to here as Labor's relative advantage in Victoria is narrowed by 3.4%. What I mean there is the difference between the two-party preferred vote in Victoria as compared with the nation at large. In 2019, in a very bad election, Labor won the two-party preferred in Victoria. They're still winning it now, but Victoria no longer looks as exceptional as it did. The swings to Labor over the course of those two elections have been much smaller than in Victoria. The rest of the country has, in a sense, caught up with Victoria, and Victoria's exceptionalism has narrowed, if not quite disappeared. Western Australia is obviously the other state that has been behaving remarkably at state level over the course of two elections. Again, at this election, you know, a really great result for Labor in Western Australia. They picked up more, a seat they would never have imagined winning, you know, until two elections ago. But again, this is at least in the context of this election, it was in relative terms a less good result for Labor. How have I put it here? Labor's relative advantage. Labor did 3% better than nationally in 2022 and 1% better than nationally this time. So Labor won more off the back of, you know, the high tide raising all boats. It wasn't that the advantage for Labor in Western Australia widened any further than it already was. Looking deeper into what my statistical analysis showed at booth level, it really is extraordinary how much the Chinese community has clearly moved over the coalition over the course of the last elections. I think that if you go back a year, there would have been a sense that this was going to reverse. I think the seat of Chisholm in Victoria is the biggest Chinese population seat in Victoria. Everyone thought that was going to revert to the Liberals. That did not happen. And seats like Bennelong, which I think is the biggest Chinese community seat in New South Wales, it's one of the three biggest in Australia, certainly. There was a massive swing to Labor in that seat. At this election, really driving home the fact that an already massive seat at the last election. From memory, I think that seat has swung over two consecutive elections by 7% and then by 9% to Labor. Really extraordinary. So again, the same sorts of dynamics were in play at both elections. The sort of hawkishness of the coalition about China, they don't seem to have found the formula of pursuing that in a way that doesn't alienate Chinese voters. Speaking of China, I think the point that I make about Western Australia, why the COVID effect didn't wind up really at this election. Again, this is something that people who have got sort of done survey research or deeper level sort of qualitative research can discuss better than me. But I suspect that this sort of hawkishness about China doesn't play well in Western Australia because there is that sense that our resources industry, you know, booms off the strength of trade with China. And we're sort of concerned about that attitude that the coalition likes to take here. The other point that was often being made about what might be expected at this election in terms of sort of ethnic community cohorts was that you saw at the British election in July last year, a really radical movement against Labor among the Muslim community in Britain. The Labor Party lost a lot of seats which were Muslim strongholds in the UK to independents, to this very successful sort of grassroots community organisation, the Muslim Vote. An attempt was made to emulate that in Australia, with very limited success here. Again, I don't want to sort of probe into the reasons for why it happened. You really would need to go into the communities and ask people, why they remained largely loyal to Labor. There was a bit of movement against Labor in seats like Watson in Sydney, Blaxland, Cornwall in Melbourne, but absolutely nothing like what happened in the UK. At the time of the British election, I sort of identified a seat in Britain that was demographically very similar to the sorts of seats that were being won by these Muslim Vote independent candidates. I found one that was very similar to, and it was really tightly, the bigger the Muslim population of these electorates, you could use that data to predict how much Labor's vote drop in these British seats. So if you picked out a representative seat similar to seats like Watson and Blaxland, it looked to me like the Labor vote was going to drop to something like 33% was what I was predicting Labor might get if this phenomenon played out in Australia. But instead, Labor almost got 50% in those seats, 48% in Watson, 46% in Blaxland. That phenomenon simply didn't play out very much here for one reason or another. Now, the final point I've made, how much time have I got? Okay. Don't give me too much volume. Okay. Peter Dunn spent so much of his campaign running the same photo opportunity, going to petrol stations and filling out his petrol tank. And I thought, that's a good idea for a state election. That's a good bit of narrow retail politics, but you're in a federal election campaign here. You're going to have to do better than that, even this was apparent to me. But if it was going to work anywhere, the whole point of it was that the coalition thought that these sort of outer urban electorates where it's a long drive to work, they use a lot of fuel, they thought this was going to hit home, they thought that this combined with concerns about crime was going to supercharge the coalition swing, and they were going to win seats that Labor normally didn't think about losing. Werribee in Sydney, Gordon in Melbourne, I could name a bunch of others. If you squint, you can maybe see that the swing to Labor in these seats was a little bit lower than it was elsewhere, perhaps especially in Melbourne. I do think there is something going on in outer urban Melbourne that raises trouble for the state Labor government there. But that was something which really didn't come through when I tried to sort of statistically analyse it and sort of say, is it apparent that there is a statistical effect on the size of the two-party swing when you get to those sorts of outer areas that clearly loomed so very large in the coalition's calculations? The answer effectively was that there was none. And I sort of have to make it specific to Victoria to get it to work at all. So yeah, next slide. Okay, moving away from the two-party contest, we should not lose sight of the fact that this election did not see an end to the long-going trend of alienation from the two major parties. This is a very big deal. It is an international phenomenon. We are seeing it playing out in Britain at the moment in terms of the absolute collapse of the two-party system. We're not at that level yet in Australia. Are we going to be in future, or is something going on in Australia that's sort of we're more content with our lot here? I don't know. I'll leave to others to judge. But what I will do here is discuss why the Greens had such a disappointing result. And it was not primarily because their level of electoral support fell. They won Senate seats in each state. I think that seems to be locked in now. They had a small swing against them in terms of the primary vote, but nothing that would make it intuitively obvious that they're going to lose 3/4 of their House of Representatives seats. The issue here is one of the pattern of their support is not as efficient as it was. They lost votes where they needed them most and gave them where they didn't do them any good. And if under our single member electorate system, you know, you see the National Party have a bedrock of support in the country because their support is geographically concentrated, they win seats. The Greens have always struggled with that, but it has seemed in recent, not only federal but state elections in the three largest states, that the Greens have achieved enough of a critical mass of support in inner city areas that they can actually win lower house seats. I think what might be happening here, though, is that their support is getting a little bit more spread out, and that's going to become a problem for them. Well, it is a problem for them. It was at this election. The other thing that went wrong for them at this election, though, was the transfer of support from the coalition to Labor. That was the fundamental reason they lost 2 of their 3 seats in Brisbane. That before it was no great difficulty for them to finish second ahead of Labor because of the low subdued state of the Labor primary vote. But now the Labor Party vote increased. The Greens had a higher bar to clear in order to make the final count. If they get ahead of Labor, then they'll almost certainly win, unless the coalition has a high primary vote, but in which they don't in these sorts of seats. The game for them in these sorts of seats is to get ahead of Labor. If votes go from the coalition to Labor, that hurdle is higher for them to clear. And in those 2 seats especially, they failed to manage it this time. On the other hand, they did retain their other seat in Brisbane of Ryan. That's because that is a fundamentally weaker seat for Labor, and that meant they were still able to clear that bar, albeit just barely, of getting ahead of Labor and then winning the seat off Labor preferences. So, you know, maybe they could win these seats back at a future election when there's a swing against Labor, but in the context of a strong election for Labor, things are just that much more difficult for them. And we saw that to a certain extent in Western Australia at state elections as well. An advanced seat in Melbourne was a different story. A number of things went wrong for him. Part of which was that the redistribution was a bit unfortunate for him, but there was a clear, solid swing from the Greens to Labor in that seat. I shouldn't throw out that in relation to the Brisbane seats as well. The Greens vote was down in those inner urban seats of Brisbane, but there was a bigger shift from the Greens to Labor in Melbourne. And that was in there. And really surprisingly, a dramatically heavy flow of Liberal preferences to Labor in those seats. I haven't really gotten to the bottom of whether or not this is a phenomenon of this entire election, or whether this was specific to Adam Bandt, it may well have been, but Liberal Party preferences flowed very solidly to Labor. When he first won his seat, he was getting a majority of Liberal preferences. At this election, I think it would have been in the order of 80 to 20 against him, which part of that is to do with the fact that the Liberal Party now put Labor ahead of the Greens on their out of vote cards. But that has been in place for a while. That's been the case for 10 years now. Something, at least in that seat, really shifted. It didn't look obviously like he lost his seat on election night. It was a couple of days later when they started counting those Liberal preferences that it was like, wow, he has not just lost here, but lost quite badly. So the Greens vote was down in all 4 of those seats. Some suggestion for this is that alarm about Peter Dutton among progressive voters drove them to Labor. That, you know, we're so worried about Peter Dutton, we want a solid Labor government in place with a majority able to command a majority to sort of act as a bulwark, perhaps not just against Peter Dutton, but perhaps also against what was being observed in the United States. This is me blowing a bubble. I might be completely wrong about this, but I do hypothesise that young progressives are being priced out of particularly capital central business district property markets. And to illustrate what I think might be that point, what I've got here is a swing map of Melbourne in terms of the Greens swing. If we've got red colours, that means that there was a swing against the Greens. And if we've got green colours, that means there was a swing towards them. So particularly in the inner north and inner west of Melbourne, exactly where I would think, indeed quite a few people I know who fall into this category, you used to live in North Fitzroy and Clifton Hill, they're now living in Ivanhoe and Preston and Footscray and these sorts of areas further afield. I do think that we're seeing a bit of migration towards those sorts of seats. One of those seats is Fraser, which encompasses Footscray. The Greens made the final count in that seat, which they've never done before. Not doing them any good so far. They thought they might win Wills, but they didn't. But maybe what we're seeing here is that in future, provided the Greens don't go the way the Australian Democrats have managed to keep their ship afloat, in future, the front line of the battle between Labor and the Greens is not going to be so much CBD sorts of seats, but seats a little bit further afield. Now, one last slide. And now I'm looking at how the Teals went, and a mixed bag in as much as they lost the seat of Goldstein in Melbourne, but I think on the whole, Tealdon would be pretty pleased to have almost matched their performance from 2022. A lot of people were saying that that was, a one-off, and that once the odium surrounding the Morrison government had gone, that these voters would happily return to the Liberal Party. I don't think that's happened. I personally don't think that ever will happen. I think that there has been a structural change in not just Australian politics, but Western politics generally, that parties of the right, they've taken a populist turn. They're pursuing different electoral markets now. They're not going to get the urban professionals back as a reliable voter base. So the point I've made here, why did the Teals do better than the Greens? I think because that they've got a reverse situation for the Greens. Greens did badly because the Labor vote increased. The Teals did well because the Liberal vote fell. The challenge the Teals faced in some circumstances, the fact that there was, it's not like it was with the Greens, where the Greens have to get ahead of Labor and then win on their preferences. They do have to beat Liberal in a head-to-head contest, but the weakness of the Greens sapped the Liberal vote across the board and made life easier for those incumbent Teal candidates. And I think you see this in the fact that the Teal incumbents did better in Sydney than they did in Melbourne. That is a reflection of something I noticed earlier, which was that the swing was not as bad against the Liberals in Victoria as it was pretty much everywhere else. So that meant that the Teal incumbents were re-elected very handily in Sydney as part of the general performance of the Liberal Party there, and in most other places. So going forward, I would say that I think that Zoe Steggall and Warringah and Allegra Spendick and Wentworth are very well placed. Obviously, the added band experience means you should never say never. They need to avoid doing anything silly. They need to remember who their voters are and keep faith with them. But quite a number of the others, I think, would be vulnerable to a Liberal recovery, one of whom is Kate Chaney in Curtin. She did better than expected. I think it was felt that if she was going to win, she'd hang on, but she did enjoy a swing in her favour and won pretty comfortably. I have put a booth results map of Curtin on this slide. Basically, a blue number means the Liberals won that booth. A green number means Kate Chaney won that booth. This looks like the traditional pattern of Liberal versus Labor support within Curtin. The affluent western suburbs, the Liberals won those booths, whereas in the north, where Labor have at least some basis of support, the Liberals lost those booths. That doesn't mean that Kate Chaney was doing better at the northern end of the electorate at the south. The dynamic here is that because Labor have a strong basis of support, or at least a reasonable basis of support at the northern end of the electorate, they were getting a pretty solid vote. Those preferences were flying overwhelmingly to Kate Chaney, and she was winning those booths. The point that I'm trying to get across here is that when eventually Western Australia does revert to type, she is going to struggle. No matter how well she does, when the tide flows back to the Liberal Party, she will have a challenge on her hands holding her seat. And I think that is also true of a couple of the other Teals in Sydney. I think McKellar will be a different seat for the Teals to hold. On the other hand, 3 points that I'd make in relation to 3 of the Teal seats. Labor won the two-party preferred vote in Mayo, Warringah and Wentworth. Mayo is sheer Teal. I'll count her as one. That's Rebecca Sharkey. And, this is end of day stuff. Labor winning the two-party preferred in seats like Warringah and Wentworth. Absolute blue ribbon Liberal Party seats. You know, look at the people who have held those seats, prime ministers, treasurers, you name it. The Labor Party now appear to be more popular than the Liberal Party in those seats. Could Labor win those seats in the absence of a strong Teal candidate? Possibly, you know, that's the world we're living in now. On the other hand, there's a reverse to this phenomenon, which is that Labor came uncomfortably close to winning seats themselves to Teal candidates in Western Australia. Fremantle looked in doubt for quite a few days, and one of the 3 seats in the ACT, Beam, went right down to the line between Labor and the Teal Independent. And I think a big part of that is David Pocock was re-elected for the ACT Senate seat with over 40% of the vote. The vote for him was strikingly higher than the vote both for the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, and I think that carried along a good candidate with it in the lower house. And the moral of the story is, while so far the Teal Independent phenomenon has exclusively claimed Liberal Party casualties, there's no iron law that says that has to be the case in these sorts of sort of culturally progressive left sorts of seats. If a Teal Independent gets ahead of the Liberal Party and the Labor Party primary vote is not approaching 50%, then the Labor may well be in trouble. Okay, that brings me to the end. So thank you for sitting patiently for however long that was. I dare say it was.
I'm just going to hand over to Karen now for some remarks.
Sarah. Wonderful. Okay. I'm just going to pull the frame out a bit and also talk about what I think was going through people's minds and the timeline as recounting. So quick history recap of history to see what we can learn. When the Albanese government was first elected, there was a period of addressing a lot of problems that they felt had been created by the Morrison government, and my personal favourite being restoring eligibility for sole parent benefits up to when the youngest child turned 14, which made a huge difference to many people's lives. And so there was a honeymoon period of positive poll ratings for the government and Albanese through 2022. However, interest rates started to rise 3 weeks before that election, and the variable rate went from 4.5% to 7.5% by the end of the year, which is extraordinary for any government to be suffering. And it kept rising through 2023 with inflation in grocery prices, rents, and everything else except benefits and wages. These are global problems, as we all know, but they are no less real for the people who were trying to survive them. In his election night speech, Albanese announced his intention to hold the referendum on the Indigenous voice to Parliament, and we know how that played out. It's been said that the referendum was doomed as soon as Dutton decided to oppose it. It's always very important to understand the lessons of history and the real lessons of history, not imagined ones, and take note and not imagine that you're in a magical moment that can paddle upstream against that. It was defeated with soft arguments, such as, if you don't know, vote no, and pointing to Indigenous people who didn't support it, generally because they didn't think it went far enough. However, hard conclusions were drawn, and that was a huge mistake. Right-wing groups were emboldened. People tried to wind back existing aspects of respect for Indigenous culture and disadvantage, and people formed the view that right-wing populism based on promoting division and essentially scapegoating others would be successful here in the regions where people had voted no. When Peter Dutton became leader of the opposition, he was unpopular and he was seen as right-wing and possibly not very sharp. The big question was whether he would reshape that image. His standing rose through the voice referendum, particularly when he was seen to be saying something that appeared to be sensible, I think giving him the impression that he knew how to do it much better than he did. The government and public discourse had been diverted, however, from the important issues facing all ordinary Australians, such as inflation, cost of living, and the housing crisis, with no positive outcome. So that became, unfortunately, a huge circuit breaker on all the good things that the government had done previously. So not the sort of circuit breaker that anybody wants. By the end of 2024, the government was in all sorts of trouble, with people suffering enormously with the burden of costs. And from what I was hearing from Victoria in those outer suburbs, you know, that was very, very, very real anxiety about the cost of living. So deep concerns about the cost of housing and the cost of education and training, and income insecurity, making it very difficult for young people to have housing and have a family, have been there for more than a decade. And we've discussed them in these meetings through elections over all those years. The state government here has focused on jobs and reducing the cost of training as a result. Federally, the government had a record they could point to, including lots of new jobs, record low unemployment, inflation halved from 6.1 to 2.8, restoring the civil relationship with China, wage rises in certain sectors, energy bill relief, rent assistance increased for welfare recipients, and the tax cuts. But I doubt that anybody much could remember those things or think about recalling those things in the face of the huge cost of living increases, and also the fact that American politics was so prominent in the media cycles, making politics appear to be extremely performative and dramatic, and just the ordinary small decisions that actually make a big difference to people's lives much less interesting in the media cycle. So the overwhelming problem of the cost of living and the housing crisis in every state, and rising homelessness, see lots of people living in vans, myself, and a situation where even two working people could not easily afford a roof over their heads, particularly in the eastern states. So in the new year, Donald Trump started his second term as president, captured headlines every day with his turbulent decrees, trying to abolish US institutions, cut the public sector to ribbons, and mass sackings. And Dutton, as Bill was saying, echoed key Trump themes with discussion around trans people, having Doge cuts, public sector, anti-woke policies and rhetoric. February 28th saw the ambush of Zelensky in the Oval Office by Vance and Trump, which was very destructive bullying of a leader and the people who are fighting for their survival. I think that was a sharp impact in Australian politics, and also particularly Anthony Albanese spoke with strength and genuineness in his response to that event, and he seemed to just draw energy and speak much more clearly and well going forward. The stock markets fell through March. April 2nd, announcement of tariffs, further falls in the stock market. People in Australia were seeing the impact on their super balances. April 12th, Jacinta Narapinga Price vowed to make Australia great again. So you can see how long it was taking people to notice that the problem with some of this, with some of this rhetoric. Soft voters, on the other hand, are looking to see what policies and ideas the alternative government has to offer, and whether Keating was someone they can put their faith in. And we all know there was very little policy, not well thought out, prepared, no credible policies to make either the economy or people's personal circumstances better. The policies they did bring forward either alienated people or didn't resonate. The ban on work from home is one of the clearest examples. Working from home increases flexibility, reduces congestion and emissions in the cities, and women and men use it to cope with the realities of demanding jobs and family life. Sick children shouldn't go to daycare or school, even more so since the pandemic. Harassed working parents without family support used to try and push that one as far as they could. But one parent working from home helps to solve this problem for people who can actually do that. So also I'd say the coalition have long cloaked their industrial relations changes as increased flexibility for workers and employers. And this policy went against that, central tenet of liberal rhetoric. So it's impossible to see how they were actually justifying it, or, I've got no idea who they thought it would appeal to be honest. It showed he was out of touch with the needs of families and workplaces. And when he backtracked, it showed that they also had no idea what they were doing. So they didn't have a good reason as to why it was a good thing that would go against the opposition that they received. So we could have an entire discussion around the nuclear policy. And I can be confident that that wouldn't even play well in Western Australia. But it was supposed to be a big idea that kicked some inconvenient problems a bit further down the road. But it raised a lot of problems and concerns, particularly the cost. 25 cents a litre off petrol for a year was the kind of thing that soft voters in focus groups would see as insulting, to be honest. A shiny bribe that implies that people are a bit stupid and they're not looking at other policies. So obviously there are some people who don't pay a lot of attention to politics who would have been attracted to that kind of thing, but there are many, many, many soft voters who do actually look at politics quite closely when the election comes around, and that's the view they would have of policy like that. It looks like a prime thing that would be taking with one hand, giving with one hand and taking with another. So going on, we can say that historically periods of uncertainty and turmoil favour the incumbent. But that doesn't seem to ever go close to what happened here. Copying the Trump-like policies and rhetoric showed they lacked ideas, although apparently shadow ministers developed policies, but they never saw the light of day. And the Dutton government would pursue those kind of Trump-like policies. And an alternative government needs to show themselves to be capable, committed and connected to the people and the issues that are important now and in the future. And, we can see all the many, many ways where those three C's were not evidenced in their campaign. He said damaging things off the cuff, insulting people, while the Labor campaign was disciplined and adept at communicating a detailed message with some clear and simple central principles, assisted by the budget that was being brought down. So there was also a multi-layered communication campaign designed to reach lots of segments of the electorate, and a strong positive message about plans for the future, and a very, very biting negative campaign that tied together concerns about the cost of the nuclear policy, the impact it would have on services, particularly health, whereas Labor was promising a positive plan for health. And this resonated with people's concerns about the cuts that Dutton was already talking about, and with the coalition's history of ambivalence, shall we say, towards services such as Medicare, and with problems in America, particularly their lack of universal healthcare and the sackings that have been going on. I'll just say there are some very interesting parallels with 1993, seeing that was mentioned. Keating government was very unpopular and heading for defeat after a period of very high interest rates, talking, the 17%, and with more than 1 million Australians unemployed at the time of the election. So much worse in most respects than what was being dealt with here. However, John Hewson's plan that included the GST also included changes to welfare, industrial relations, and the removal of bulk billing in Medicare for all but pension and welfare recipients. So, as with this campaign, we focused on getting the message and the communication right, not the horse races, mostly because, I don't know about this time, but at that time there wasn't the money. I'm not sure it was done a much constrained budget compared to some of previous elections. So that was the focus. And after the election, the folklore and the media focused very heavily on the GST and birthday cakes and things. But along with the cost of everything will rise message, the most significant issues and the most effective negative ads we had was on Medicare and the cost for families. Medicare was very central in people's thinking. And the central argument was that these changes would take Australia closer to the American system. And at that time, people like now saw the importance of Australian values and were prepared to protect the important pillars of our system. So another parallel I'd like to highlight is the importance of election night speeches. In '93, Paul Keating made a huge effort through the election campaign to be humble. Really, to acknowledge mistakes and to listen and understand, listen very carefully and understand what people were feeling and how to communicate with people where they were and to explain the risks with genuineness, to actually connect with people through that campaign. However, on election night, that went out the window, and his speech failed to acknowledge that the Australian people had very, very, very reluctantly voted to give him another opportunity to address Australia's problems because the alternative vision was not the right direction. And, you know, perhaps these days we call that a bit of a trauma response, but it did sow the seeds for the resounding defeat in 1996. In a very marked contrast, Anthony Albanese and those in the campaign understood where they'd been, why they received the vote they did, and what people want to see from their government and in their communities. His speech on election night reflected all of that, and I think that was a very important speech, and I hope it gets distributed around the place. I don't think the contrast is an accident at all. And there are some people, I mean, I'm aware of people who will have, whose fingerprints I saw on that speech this time. It was really, really good. So 93 was also one because people deeply believe in the importance of Australian values and the very negative aspects of the American version of politics and the economy over there is something that people understand. So as we've seen this time, there's always a need for very good communication and good policies based on core values, good narrative, and importantly, truth. Strategy and even tactics are in the service of these. They're hopeless without them. And as I said last time, the importance of building communities, connecting with communities and improving our institutions can't be overstated to protect our democracy in the future. So, Mark knows that it's very hard to repeat high votes for Labor in Western Australia.
People keep telling me this, but
and more and Bullwinkle were one, so that's you know, was an excellent result, but very hard fought.
just thanks, Karen. What I might do is I'll quickly speak to the national strategy and how it relates specifically to WA. And then I might just skip straight to responding to some of the moments in the campaign and some of William's points in particular on landslides, China as it relates to the Western Australian psyche, or however you want to say it, and so on. So first of all, there's been a few different sets of pillars that people have talked about when they've talked about the federal campaign. There's people talking about 4 pillars, 5 pillars, 6 pillars. I'm a shorter is better person. So the way I saw it, we fought the election on 4 main pillars. And those were sort of arrived at towards the end of last year, when I think it's fair to say that we all felt things were in a different place to where they were in May when we actually had the election. So those pillars were choice, delivery, offer, and contrast. It was abundantly clear that we had to make the election a choice between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, because if we didn't do that, it would be a referendum on how people saw the government having operated over the last 3 years. We didn't feel that that was a risk we wanted to take. In order to do that, we had to then remind people of the delivery that had happened, because we knew that people hadn't seen it or had forgotten about it, or were concentrating or dwelling on other things like the voice referendum. So we had to be really clear about reminding people of the good, efficient work that government had actually delivered over that 3 years, and start to roll out pieces towards the end of the year to remind them. Where the offer sat, we knew that when we started coming forward with election commitments this time round, they had to speak to the delivery piece that we'd done. So you didn't see the government decide to try and take the election in a whole new tack, in a different direction, and boldly reframe by going to somewhere completely different. Any election commitment that was talked about, any of those forward offerings, to use the attractive news buzz term that everyone used during the campaign, they had to speak to things we had already talked about and things we had already delivered. And we could do that with strength. We could do that by focusing on cost of living. We could do that by focusing on health, talking about childcare. People had already been reminded, or were being reminded, of the things we'd done there. So talking to them about election commitments in that space, those election commitment opportunities became possible and achievable, and something that people could buy and we would actually deliver. In doing all of those pieces, to sort of circularly bring it back to choice at the start, we could offer a sharp contrast between us and the opposition. We used some of their initial election commitments to help us, with that contrast. The nuclear power plant was something that we very clearly zoned in on, as we knew the electorate through our research program had clear misgivings. We could see policy problems in the plan to begin with. And so we honed in on that to such an extent that by the election campaign proper, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to go anywhere near it. They certainly didn't want to go to Collie or any of the other places. They talked about stationing these things. They knew they were on a turkey there. So that was the sort of 4-pillar strategy for the campaign. And I guess in retrospect, one of the interesting things for me looking at their campaign, we do a lot of black hatting during elections. There are groups of people that often think about what the opposition is going to do in response, or what they might trot out in the election. And I do think that, one of the main problems that the opposition had in the federal election campaign was they weren't very good at black hatting where we might go. And their research program was completely piss poor. I'm going to use some pretty straightforward language. So that was the national pillars, and they largely worked in WA too. To speak to where we were at in WA, we had some advantages. We also had what I would term first world problems. A good first world problem for us was, while we had a very strong brand here through successive good results and election victories at a state and federal level, and consequently that also meant that we had really strong campaign infrastructure in terms of the amount of money that had flown in to party office over the years, the amount of volunteers and support, the membership growth that we'd had over that time. All of that is fantastic for us. The first world problem was that we had to deal with a state election right before. So we were left with this really tricky scenario where I normally do this with my hands, but I've got a microphone right now. The elliptical nature of the election cycle, where we've got a 3-year federal term and a 4-year term, meant that they'd almost never been closer together. So managing the campaign workload of MPs, of candidates, of the volunteers, of the staff involved over what would essentially turn into an almost 5-month stretch was still a problem. It was fantastic that we had so many people involved, but that was a particular WA issue that we had to combat. Having said that, first world, because we had a lot more people than the Libs and the Naps had, and they still essentially had to do the same thing. We made a very disciplined decision early on prior to the state campaign, which was tough for both the state show and the federal show, that we would reserve oxygen for each campaign in particular. And by that, I mean, we did not do a lot of federal election campaign work between January and the state election in March. And that was that's okay, I can talk over the top of anything. I was a union official 8 months ago, so tougher credits than this. We had to take that really disciplined decision that we were not going to talk about federal issues, that the federal campaign would essentially go into a box for a couple of months. That was really tough. That was tough on members, that was tough on candidates, that was tough on the people that wanted to pound the pavement and talk about those issues. But we knew that a strong state result would give us the momentum that we could fill it into the federal election. And in a 2-election environment in WA, we can only talk about one thing at a time to most voters. It's fair to say most voters don't look like this group in terms of their level of engagement in politics and their ability to separate things out. So we had to focus on one piece and then go into the other. Managing their stamina through that was a really tough balance, but I do think clearly in retrospect, we got that right. There was a huge task for us in holding on to the haul of seats that we had last time. And we kind of bucked a couple of trends. You know, it was such a flat swing in 2022 at WA. It was clear that a huge factor in that had been COVID, the McGowan government's response to it. The level of support was near uniform. So the idea that we could hold onto all of those seats, particularly when we were looking at it last year, was very, very difficult. What I would say was essential in retaining those seats, particularly I think of Tangney, which was a line ball seat all the way to the end, was we had a couple of members who were elected in 2022 whose offices and teams were ruthless about using incumbency to their advantage for the full 3 years. I don't mind saying that we often see it in politics, that people get elected and then 7 or 8 months out from the next election, suddenly realise that they have to run a campaign. It happens. What we had in some of those class of 22 federal members were people that absolutely understood that they were sort of there by the grace of a good campaign and a wonderful moment in history, but that they would not endowed that forever and they had to work hard. Sam and his team knocked on tens of thousands of doors in the clear air they had before they even had a candidate to go up against. And I do think that that meant such a difference to them. When you look at some of the other seats that we picked up, now I'll focus on Bullwinkle actually. Bullwinkle was a particular nerve-wracking proposition for us because new seat, no incumbent, and we saw something that we've seen just a couple of months before in the state election in some of the regional areas where the two opposition parties were kind of vertically stacking candidates, and one was going to end up using them, the other one is almost a step ladder to try and get ahead. We were hoping that that would give rise to a level of conflict between the two opponents in the race. That would have been very handy. I actually think for the most part, Mia and Matt were reasonably disciplined in that sense. So we had to throw absolutely everything at Bullwinkle. What we ended up with was a field campaign that was sort of top 4 across the nation, But I'll be really blunt. I think we spent more money on that seat, particularly on targeted digital advertising, than we spent on any individual seat in the state ever. Like, we really went for it, and that was a massive effort. And we're so happy that we got it over the line. But that was a huge task. Just quickly to Fremantle. I won't say much about it here, other than to say that clearly there are lessons to be learned. I think that when I talk about the incumbency being used so ruthlessly by the class of 2022, Kate was able to build an interesting amount of profile over a long period of time. Anyone who's even mildly interested in the goings-on of Fremantle has known about Kate Hewlett for a while. She spent a very long time building a profile out there that was initially soft and commercial, and then started moving into political issues. So she found a way to turn herself into almost an incumbent candidate. And so I do think that that represents a challenge, and the advantage we have now at state and federal level there is hopefully we've learned the lesson. We will continue to learn the lesson. There's clearly a research piece off the back of this. But Simone and Josh now have 4 years and 3 years respectively to correct everything there. I'll quickly go to some of the policy specific pieces and what we saw in the research. And I'll start with work from home. Again, when we were building the pillars towards the end of last year, clearly we were in a different environment than we were by the time of the campaign proper. And we were just about to see Trump win, and clearly Dutton thought that was a good thing for him, Trump winning, and that movement was happening across the world. And the subsequent discovery that Trump governing would be bad for him was clearly a rude shock that he was underprepared for. I think that speaks to the Poll research program that they clearly had in terms of their quantitative polling, and I think in their qualitative research quite possibly as well, because it was coming through pretty loud and clear for us, particularly once the tariffs and the work from home policy stuff came to the fore. The tariff conversation, there is a particular type of bloke that the party is mildly concerned about, a young person that is starting to lean populist and conservative in an interesting way that we're still trying to fathom. Many of those people are kind of into Trump as an abstract concept, someone who is an agitator and a disruptor and is willing to flip the table and blow things up a bit just to shake it up. The second they felt that actually directly impacted on their life, things shifted. So the second they realized the tariffs might have a direct impact on their lives, their livelihoods, their jobs, their earning capacity, those people became bothered in groups. And similarly, the shift that we saw away from common finding on the Prime Minister towards the end of last year might have been that, he's nice and he seems good enough, but he's a bit soft and a bit meh and a bit fuzzy. And, Dutton, I don't really like him, but I know where he stands and there's a point of clarity there and I can appreciate that. All of that flipped on its head once the tariff stuff kicked in. Even for some of those people that were abstractly interested in Trump, they started to realize that having this strong, the clarity became chaos. And so we went from having a strong, clear leader potential in Dutton to someone who might do something a bit silly and try to shirt front another leader, and that you couldn't really poke the bear with Trump in the US. And conversely, Albanese's fuzziness all of a sudden was seen as, oh, well, actually, he seems like a safe, sensible pair of hands and someone who can manage other people's personalities and egos. And so to watch that flip was fascinating, and really sort of gave us a bit of confidence that we were on the right pathway. And similarly, some of it's a pretty policy-free zone. But when they did have a policy, and work from home is a great example, where clearly a lot of what they were coming up with for the election campaign was driven by the sort of ideological rump of the party, and then not necessarily run through a testing and research process to see if it was actually a good idea. And work from home for us certainly felt like that, like it had come from some ideological network sitting in the back of a room somewhere. But the idea that Dutton could come out 3 years ago and say, well, clearly our pathway to victory is in the outer suburbs, and then roll out a policy that was incredibly detrimental to them in the suburbs of Melbourne, where people had particularly been impacted by lockdowns and COVID, and had to rely on work from home. But even from my own personal experience, being involved in research in the outer suburbs here, you would talk night after night to women in Ellenbrook who would raise it unprompted as just an abjectly stupid thing to have announced and rolled out that would certainly hit them and hit their friends. And there was a level of vitriol there that was going to be really hard for the opposition to roll back. And thankfully they didn't roll it back quick enough, left it dangling. And then when they finally did try to put the genie back in the bottle, it had the two-prong effect of like no one really believed them. They knew that like deep down they were anti-work from home, and then that had sort of baked in. But again, it undercut the clarity and the strength piece for Dutton. You know where he stands. All of a sudden in the middle of an election campaign, you don't know where he stands. He's changed his position. It reinforced the chaos concern. So all of those pieces really built together for us. And yeah, the tariff moment became quite critical for us. I'm conscious of time, so I'm actually going to race right down to a few other pieces, specifically China. So, and this goes again to the, you know, when we were talking to people about the tariffs and the global economy, I'm going to really stand up for Western Australians for 10 seconds here. A lot of people on the East Coast think that they're really worldly and, you know, like smart people who are keyed into the rest of the world, you know, really in touch with, you know, all of culture and the global economy. Western Australians understand, even if it is at a reasonably thin, shallow level at times, how entirely dependent we are on the global economy, how export driven the state is, and that if China catches a cold at some point, we're going to as well. And again, this was something that we could see in the research, not just specifically on the tariff issue, but they felt that Dutton had a track record as someone who was anti-China, and you know, if you chuck that in with clarity becoming chaos and strong landing and shared fronting, if there are two countries that people were reasonably sure we shouldn't pick a fight with, it was the United States and China. And so that all fed again into a level of nervousness, particularly for those people in the outer suburbs that Dutton was trying to reach, that he clearly posed a threat to them and their livelihoods. So I just, you know, I think that was a really clear thing for us, was how quickly Western Australians latched onto the potential effects of this, not just with the US, but the Chinese economy and therefore their jobs. And the last thing I just want to touch on is the landslides and their possibility. They are possible, but I think that where I'll slightly defend Stephen Smith is you do still need an extraordinary set of circumstances to trigger one. That, you know, we really have only seen that a couple of times since Federation. The Prime Minister played a blinder, and the party did really well to win on the unifying, dominating issue of cost of living, which in itself was incredibly tricky for an incumbent government. But I think they did it by rolling out a set of solutions to tackle the issue, by clearly communicating in a way that the electorate understood that it was a global thing, that this was happening everywhere, that this wasn't just us. And the Libs tried to push against that, but didn't win the arguments. You need to win on that unifying, dominating issue. And I've not seen a dominating issue like cost of living at this election at any point in the 20 years that I've been doing this. In the face of everything, you need your campaign to be very well engineered and resourced and incredibly disciplined. And I think we saw that at every day as well, like the Prime Minister brought focus each day and so did the rest of the team. And we didn't attempt to play in their turf. We didn't attempt to engage with the opposition on, you know, Peter Dutton's fuel excise discount or his various high-no truck trips to petrol stations. We had a plan and we stuck to it religiously. You do require diabolical nonsense from the other side, and thankfully we got that. You know, a lot of people who've been doing this a lot longer than me said it's the worst campaign they'd ever seen from the opposition. I hope to see one worse. But I'll live and pray for that one. And yeah, I do think lastly, to come back to the tariff piece, having external circumstances that work in favour of the party that you're part of is also extremely helpful. Clearly, Trump and the tariffs were this sort of late dealt ace in the hole that assisted us. So I will stop talking so that we've got enough time for an ample amount of questions. I realise that's the role of the last person on the channel is to talk the least, and I'll hand over.